Okay. So did you want to go through the site planning stuff, or do you want me to? How do you want to do it?
If you want to go for it, that's okay.
Okay, awesome. So thanks everyone. Sorry about the break there. But we thought it would be an interesting exercise. So Fabian went through in quite a level of detail the policy component and the things that we're considering in terms of ADU. So we thought it would be interesting to kind of have a conceptual model because we can't meet in person right now. So we figured we would try some kind of way to put the policy piece on paper so that we can also get some more feedback. So what we've kind of created here, just like different options. So we have sort of an urban area, single detached dwelling lot with a detached sort of accessory building already. That's what the orange is. And so we have a single with a detached, let's say garage. Then we'll have a single with an attached garage. And then semis here, just sort of for illustrative purposes. And we were hoping to kind of like talk through with images some of the components we're seeking feedback on. So to a lot of the questions that were raised as well, like if this was if we use, let's say, lot number 1 here in the urban area, if we had an existing single detached dwelling with a detached garage with access onto sort of the street in the front, sort of like if it's an existing building, would everyone be okay if somebody wanted to sort of build on top, to build the unit, the ADU on top, and would the setbacks that currently exist sort of pose any impacts, let's say, to the neighboring units? So we were just kind of wanting to go through and have those types of conversations and maybe talk about the size of the ADU and like access, because a couple of the other components that we probably didn't, mention too much is the parking piece. So the primary dwelling from a zoning perspective requires 2 parking spaces, which is often accommodated inside of a garage and then maybe on the driveway somewhere. But if you want to include an accessory dwelling unit, whether it's sort of an interior unit or let's say if it's inside one of these garages, you'd have to provide an additional parking space. So parking is also kind of a consideration we're thinking about when we're going to implement changes. So we were also kind of looking for feedback in that regard, because let's say you're in a semi-detached and you want to put your ADU in a building in the backyard, and you have your driveway and you probably have a garage here, so you can accommodate the 2 parking spaces for your unit, your semi, but you have to then provide another parking space for the unit here. So, are people going to be okay with an additional parking space out front? Should we be thinking about when we're building new homes to maybe increase the size of a side yard so that we can actually get a car down in here to accommodate another unit? So we were kind of hoping to go like to get comments like that, or if there are any kind of technical zoning comments from the group based on the feedback that Fabian gave through his presentation regarding the proposed changes.
Sorry, Jen, did you mean proposed changes for the parking or?
Well, I mean the proposed amendments to anything that Fabian mentioned. So even like the discussion about like interior side yard, if we're okay to have an ADU closer to an interior side yard, and parking. I'm just trying to like throw out different topics to see if there's questions from the group so that we can kind of go through it. And then maybe we can illustrate it a little bit.
Well, I don't know if we have anyone from building on here. I don't think so, but right now an existing accessory building can be 1.2 meters to a property line, right? So if we're going to now add a dwelling unit on the top, then there may be some issues, with windows and things like that. I don't know, but or if we have one that's existing closer to the property line than what's required, there could be code related issues as well.
Right.
that's where I mean, that goes back to my previous question about existing structures, and how that interacts with those required setbacks. Because are you going to require to step back the second floor that you add to your garage if your garage is already closer to the lot line?
Yeah, because I think there's a few things we need to consider. So like, let's say this building here, this orange one at the back was constructed and it's there, it's existing as a garage. There might not be any openings along this side. So it might meet the setback in the zoning, but it will also meet any kind of limiting distance separation issue or calculation in the building code. I guess to Roxanne's point, like if we add a second story to it, we also have the limiting distance requirement if people then want to have sort of openings on this side of the unit. So that would be sort of a limitation in a sense. So that's the building code. So from a zoning perspective, we might be okay if the structure is 2 stories and is still kind of meeting that setback. But then it kind of comes down to the practicality of whether or not we can issue a building permit.
I'm also curious in terms of the parking piece of things, especially looking at an example like the one all the way on the left there.
This one?
That makes me sort of wonder, do you count tandem parking spots as, like, it's one thing to say for, like a home that is shared by one family, that, yeah, if mom's car is the last one in, dad can ask mom to move her car or take her keys and move it out of the way. Now, for an accessory dwelling unit, a lot of these existing houses don't have 2-lane driveways. So there may be room to put 3 cars or 2 cars or however many, but that would be tandem. And does that still meet the requirements if realistically that could potentially trap one resident's car behind others? Because all that's going to do is, even if they have a parking spot, they're still going to park on the street.
I'm looking that up right now, but I believe that we could only have, I believe it'd have to be the same unit in tandem. Separate unit would have to be individual, but
So, I mean, to me, that's a major consideration in terms of how many people are actually going to be able to take advantage of this, ability to add ADUs. If at the end of the day, everyone is shot down because of parking, because they don't build houses with giant, huge, wide driveways all the time. And so being able to provide a completely separately accessible parking spot can be very challenging on existing lots.
yeah, and I believe that is a lot of our challenges in the urban residential areas.
Yeah.
We're currently working in our village is a Waterford subdivision to get a variance to add the second parking space in the driveway on homes that have single car garages in order to get the cars off the streets.
So would that be like, let's say, a smaller landscaped front yard and then like a second parking space here in the front? Is that what you're considering in Waterford? Yeah.
Yeah.
That's why we're having these conversations, because it's good to reach out to the public to see like some of, it's one thing from our end, but also from the public's perspective and the difficulties that they've faced as well, because we're trying to satisfy as many people as we possibly can. But in doing so, we've also realized that there's also some components that that as much as we tried to satisfy everybody, it's very difficult to do so. So there might be some who, it doesn't work out for them to have those units, but the intent is that we're still providing the option for the county as a whole to provide these units as best as we possibly can.
So I guess I had a question.
I just feel like, sorry. No.
Well, I guess my question for the group would be like, so we have the requirement currently exists, and we're only allowed to have one ADU, but you have to have one parking space for that one ADU. Does the group think that one parking space per ADU is too onerous? Do we think that 2 parking spaces per, one unit for the primary unit is too much? Like, do we think that we're asking for too much parking, or do we think that the parking is required because people still need access to their vehicles? Or like, do we think that there might be an option to maybe not require so much parking, or will that just sort of end up with people parking on streets?
That's exactly what I was going to ask about, because I often have clients say, well, do we really need all this parking? And Norfolk County has really relied on parking because everybody relies on cars to get places. With the small bus routes we have now within Norfolk, there is a little bit less reliance because you can take that bus to get downtown if you need to, but it's still not the same as having a vehicle. So I'm of mixed emotions on this one as to whether you always need to have the parking spaces or not. There may be some times when it could be relaxed, but in the same token, when I drive down the street and the cars are parked out on the street all the time, then it causes traffic issues. So it's complicated.
Yeah, parking is definitely a hot topic in every municipality I've worked in. So I think like Fabian and I have talked about this like together, and there's definitely got to be a balance, I think, if we want to have or encourage units, but also kind of make the right call when it comes to parking. So
sorry,
I think one of the bigger, sorry.
Sorry, I just found in the bylaw, just to clarify about the parking. So for the accessory residential parking, you can have one parking space in the front yard, provided that a minimum of 50% required front yard landscape is maintained. Now, there is the option, maybe Jen and Fabian, if that was relaxed a bit on the 50% front yard landscape to allow, instead of having to apply for a planning application for the 50%, because a lot of people wouldn't be able to maintain that 50% if we wanted another residential parking spot in the front yard. Just something I just was reading now.
Yep.
Roxanne, I'm leaning towards let's keep the 50% landscape open space and say you don't need a parking space.
No, I know you like your green space.
Well, no, I just think like we also have policies in the OP, like this is the planner in me and sorry group, but this is the planner in me where it's like you read the OP from beginning to end, and like there's kind of some context pieces in there where we want to maintain our character. And I'm just trying to think of like what's the balance to maintaining our character and still kind of getting units. And if more people want cars, then I'm in the minority that want to keep like, a nice, what's
landscape.
The right land, like or just even like a nice like
Streetscape.
Yeah, streetscape. Sort of, you know what I mean? Instead of seeing cars all just like in front of the houses. So, but that's just me. So that's why
I agree. I agree with Jennifer 100% on that, because it just turns the front of the buildings, like the front of every building, into a parking lot. If we don't, like the same way, if they're like, if it just means that they have to go for a variance, then they have to go for a variance. But at least kind of like in terms of the as little, like removing barriers. If you want it to be barrier free, then I guess you got to fit into the rules. Otherwise, you got to jump through the hoops.
And that's where we've had those conversations because so Jen leans one way and I lean the other way because so we've had those internal those talks about which avenue to take and what to propose and so on. But that's where we've kind of like agreed to disagree in some instances, but also recognizing that at the end of the day, even though we're trying to satisfy as many people as possible, there will still be those that will require planning applications at the end of the day. And as much as we're trying to eliminate the need for those, to make it easier for the public to implement these units, at the end of the day, it's very realistic that some might still require a planning application, and it is what it is.
That being said, though, I also feel that you know, the half of the time, very positive, good developments can often get tanked purely because of parking, especially in Norfolk County. And I think that there needs to be some loosening up of that in terms of those parking requirements, because at every turn, it feels like something that would be a net positive in every single other way gets overcomplicated and tanked because of parking.
Yeah, parking is just like a complicated, even though it seems so simple, it just becomes really complicated. Like even for like our discussion today. So like if we look at like a higher, I know I only kind of put the conceptual semis, but like we're getting more and more townhouse applications too, right? So it's like even when you have multiple units that all have driveways because they all require parking, and then if you can have your ADU, you need another parking space, but it sort of restricts access to the backyard. So you really are limited. So then like all of the front essentially would become for parking. So then we lose that 50% space. But then it's like, even if the occupants, like from the primary unit, have 2 spaces, and then the ADU has 1 space, you can't even park on the street because the driveways are too close to fit in a parking space on the street. So then it really becomes like someone who might live here is parking on a street a block away because we can't even accommodate street parking either. So then we get like, then other residents are upset because people are parking on the streets that don't live there either. So parking, I know it sounds like trivial, but it does like impact more people than I think we think. But Fabian, what were some of the other setbacks we wanted to get some feedback on? Like I know size was one thing, but we kind of touched on that in our discussion through the questions. But
the other would be the so if you have an existing garage and working with the setback components, that was one of them. I'll pull up the PowerPoint that I kind of outlined the questions that we anticipated there. So yeah, the setbacks. Oh, and an accessory dwelling unit on the second story. Like there's been, we've, some internal conversations that have happened, and there's been some feedback that's been received for both the pros and cons of having an ADU in a detached garage being on the second story. Is there any commentary or feedback surrounding that topic? Whether in favor or against, that's totally fine.
You can register me as being in favor.
Perfect. Yeah,
Yeah,
so there with.
Oh.
Sorry, Fabian, go ahead.
I was also going to say that I know that our current policies say that like the exterior changes to the building and the facade and like the changes of the exterior of the building. I think one thing that we can potentially look at as well is looking at having, like, say for example, if you look at that first single detached unit, the first square that you have there, Jen. Yeah, that one. So say for example, along the interior side yard where the garage is located, looking at potentially implementing provisions that would prevent someone from putting a window on that side of the building to eliminate oversight concerns into the abutting property. So if there was to be a window, it would have to be facing into on the right there where your mouse is.
Yeah, so through like an internal discussion, some of the pros and cons of a second story ADU were privacy concerns. So there was, as our lot fabric becomes smaller, there was some concern about, a second story unit maybe being a bit imposing, and taking away the privacy in the rear yards. So we were kind of wondering if, what the thoughts are on that. We've heard from Helene and she's supportive of it. So that would be, we're kind of looking for feedback on that, and then like how close, that building can be to the property line where we kind of think is sufficient or not, because of the same kind of thing for like noise and privacy. If someone's living here and then if, the neighbor wants to have, quiet outdoor space, it was identified that, there might be some conflicts conflicts with that. So we were hoping to get some feedback as well in that regard. And again, whether it's you have no concerns at all, or if there are, you know, some concerns, we'd like to hear that as well.
I would say that putting in declaration that there can be no openings on the overhanging side I could see that becoming both problematic from code requirements, you know, for, I don't know, air and ventilation and light and stuff, but also just for pleasantness of spaces. So I don't know if there's a way to still allow openings, but maybe minimize them so that they're not, you know, not a wall of windows, but, you know, not being able to have any kind of opening could be challenging for making livable spaces.
Okay, but any concerns about like conflicts between neighbors if you have someone sort of living above a garage? Any privacy concerns, noise concerns? And if you've already answered these in the survey, I can appreciate that too. But so that's kind of what we were wanting to present in terms of the urban area. And then I know we had talked about the agricultural area, and oops, excuse my very crude agricultural drawing here.
Should have made it green.
Green was my color for landscaped open space. But yeah, so to the point of, I think it was Cedric earlier. So yeah, like we might have in the agricultural area, someone might have like a rather large lot and this, you know, might be their home. So to the question, like is 30 meters, and this is obviously not to scale, but like is 30 meters, we tend to get more questions about that maximum distance in the agricultural area because generally lots are smaller elsewhere and they can meet that 30-meter requirement. But do we have concerns, not concerns? Like we heard through the question period, like we got some feedback there, but this was sort of the second component to our breakout session to talk about the agricultural area. So I'm not sure if anybody else has any like comments or questions about ADUs in the agricultural area, but we'd be open to kind of like any feedback or kind of like working through the 30-meter piece here as well.
The 30 meters is interesting because I've had experience where it can be as long as part of it is within the 30 meters. It doesn't have to all be within it. So I think the text should more clearly explain that.
Thanks. That is something that we, not just you and your clients, but that's something that we get asked quite frequently. And I think the direction that we've kind of taken is that the entirety of the building is to be within 30 meters. But that's something that we're obviously gonna look at.
Just as long as it's clarified, whatever it is, it'd be good.
Yeah, because right now it's kind of gray.
Yeah, although I will admit locating it within 30 meters could be challenging in a lot of situations.
For sure, especially if the entirety of the building has to be within 30 meters. I would say at least a solid maybe like 10 of those meters are dedicated to the building itself. So
yeah,
I'd go back and talk about the requirements for septic fields and stuff, like the space for that as well. And for example, our property is up on the ridge above the Lynn Valley. So our open space that's not already occupied by a septic field is literally down, like it's down at the bottom of the hill. So we, you know, like all of a sudden it's just kind of an eliminated option just because of the nature of the landscape.
Right. Yeah, because I think right now, to Fabian's point, the way that it's written is pretty unclear. So I think what we've been doing have been like 30 meters from like the closest wall of the primary dwelling to the first wall of the ADU, and if that's 30 meters, then we've kind of been okay with that. But I think the question is now should the 30 meters like clarify so that that is the case, or if the 30 meters should include the whole?
I think it should
the whole.
definitely clarify. It just makes it easier, right? And that's what we're trying to do, is eliminate any confusions that we can, right? Just to make it clear for everyone involved, not just the public, but literally everyone involved.
I guess I'm not understanding why the 30-meter limit is there in the first place for larger properties, just because like if it's just a question of like we don't want there to be like we don't want there to be a perception that it's two separate lots, and like we don't want to worry, like it's you're going and you're hobbling landowners to do whatever is the most whatever is the most practical or reasonable thing for their land and their situation and what they're looking to do, because of something that at the end of the day, it's not a separate lot. And if it can't be severed, it can't be severed. So I just don't understand why this arbitrary distance limit is being imposed for just what seems like strange perceptual reasons.
Yeah, I think it's more than perception. I think because again, we're trying to think of like a zoning provision that would apply to everybody. And then if we do have policies regarding surplus farm dwellings as well. So I think in terms of, let's say if I own this farm now and this works for me, the 30 meters works for me, and I build, an ADU, and then in 10 years I want to sell the property, then another farmer buys it, they could essentially sever the house. And I think because we're also tied to policies about surplus farm dwellings, and then because the accessory dwelling unit would have to stay with the farmhouse in terms of the severance, we really need to minimize the size that surplus farm dwelling severance could be. And so if the ADU, because it, for the previous owner was 100 meters away, that really means the only way you could sever that is if you essentially cut the farm in half, which is something staff would never support, neither would the province. So I think we're also thinking about those types of things, Helene, to be honest. So it's not necessarily just a perception, but it's also sort of like we have other policies that we have to consider and what the implications are. And that's definitely one of them, the surplus farm dwellings. So that's another reason why I think on ag land, we're not trying to restrict people who live there either. So saying you can't have them, but we're just trying to think about like what's reasonable in terms of like for future, because we're also planners who have to think about long-term implications. And from my perspective, that would definitely be one of them as well.
Yeah, it's also
can you just very quickly explain what the excess farm dwelling severance thing is?
We can talk about that. We could set up a meeting and talk about that. It's a little bit outside the ADU kind of topic.
Okay, no, it just means that farmers, if there's an accessory, like if there's an extra farm building, they somehow have some right to sever the property to sell that as something separate. Like
no. It's
okay,
I can
talk to you.
Yeah, we can talk about that after. It's just essentially like this accessory dwelling unit will always be connected to the house. So if this accessory dwelling unit is like on the other end of a farm, it's like this house could never be severed from the farm. So it would always have to stay. And then we're going to have other policy implications for that. So I think it just makes more sense to have an accessory dwelling unit as close to the primary dwelling as possible because it is accessory to that dwelling unit. So anyways, that's my take on that. So it's not just about perception, it is tied to a couple other things.
It's also, by limiting the distance, it will hypothetically reduce the impact on an agricultural field, right? So like typically on farms, what we see is like you have the primary residence, there might be a barn, maybe some silos, like farm related buildings, and then it doesn't make sense to have an ADU 50 meters away from the primary residence in the middle of a field. It makes sense to keep construction within one confined area to the farm, as opposed to putting it in the middle of a field. So that's another reason as to for the 30 meters. It's more so to kind of provide a building envelope on a property, as opposed to allowing this building envelope, but then you can also go way over there in the middle of a field, because realistically, once you build the building, it's probably never going to become a farm portioned again. Like that portion where the building is, it'll probably never become a farm parcel piece again. So it's really trying to reduce the impacts on the agricultural area while still providing housing.
Okay, well, I guess from, yeah, you guys think about fields and I think about cliffs because I live on one. So it's sort of like there's different like not every large property is just big open agricultural fields, but I guess not every rule can be made to accommodate every single variation of property type. So
I was thinking of affordability as well. If these units are closer to the main unit, you're probably more able to have the hydro line come in, shared internet, other things that could keep it less expensive housing. Just another thought.
Yeah, and we've seen people come into, like, to Helene's point about the septic, like it's not lost on us, but to have another like accessory dwelling unit closer, you can tie into the septic system even if you have to make it slightly larger, which I'm hearing from people at the counter is a little less expensive than having to like build a brand new septic system for an accessory dwelling unit on its own. So, sorry, Fabian, if you were going to add anything.
No, I was just going to add to Mary's point, the amenities is definitely, like, it definitely makes it more desirable to, you know, especially nowadays, with working from home being a lot more common, the access to amenities, right? So like having internet, that's something that's critical for most people nowadays. So as opposed to if it was further away, probably not able to get internet or the same quality of internet.
I mean, that makes perfect sense. It just in general, but a maximum distance, you know, just because the maximum distance is higher doesn't mean that someone can't put an ADU closer. So, I mean, if financially and for things like services, it makes sense to have it closer, then you'll put it closer. I'm just saying that by having a kind of declarative maximum that, you know, it doesn't impact people who have reasons to put it closer. It does impact people who have reasons to put it further. So that's the only thing.
We'll definitely take your feedback for consideration on that point. So Fabian, that I think concludes our site planning session, unless there was more you wanted to add or something we forgot.
No, I was looking at the points. I mean, it seemed like there was no opposition to the ADU being taking up the entirety of a basement. I thought that was pretty well received. I know only, I think, one or two people vocalized their support for it, but in lieu of any opposition, I'm assuming that means support. Other than that, it was the garden suite policy review, but we also touched on that part too. So I think we touched on all the elements that we had wanted to and more.
Perfect. So I think unless there's any other comments or questions that anybody wants to ask at this time, I think we're going to thank everybody for your participation in the session. And we will be posting the video online. But if you do have any other questions or if you haven't completed the survey yet on our Engage Norfolk site, I encourage you to do so. And thank you. And again, if you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to email Fabian or myself. So thank you again. Thank you, everyone, for your participation.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jen. Thanks, Fabian. Great session.
Thanks, Helene.